I turn on this thing?
Yeah,
No.
turn it on. We can turn this one too. Go for it.
What's
Oh, yeah, don't do that.
chlorophyll?
Oh, yeah, no, just leave it. Sorry.
Okay.
All right. So, recording has begun. We're on chapter 48. So we got 48, 49, 50. So, 3 more weeks. We're at the tail end. The family is in place. Everything is basically fine. All that's left is the long process of Jacob dying. Yes. So,
Shakespearean death.
yeah. He's gonna throw down some blessings in this chapter. The next chapter is just a super long blessing. Jacob finally dies, and in the last chapter, I'm sorry. The last chapter is some stuff with Joseph. But there's a lot of pretty significant stuff that happens with that. So let's get started.
Chapter 48. After this, Joseph was told, "Behold, your father is ill." So he took with him his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And it was told to Jacob, "Your son Joseph has come to you." Then Israel summoned his strength and sat up in bed. And Jacob said to Joseph, "God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me and said to me, 'Behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will make of you a company of peoples and will give this land to your offspring after you for an everlasting possession.' And now your 2 sons, who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are. And the children that you fathered after them shall be yours. They shall be called by the name of their brothers in their inheritance. As for me, when I came from Paddan, to my sorrow Rachel died in the land of Canaan on the way, when there was still some distance to go to Ephrath. And I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem."
Okay.
I like how the voice for Jacob continues in the parenthetical statement.
Yeah, it's a part of the quote. Because those quotes were definitely there originally, right? So okay, so
Whippersnappers, that's Bethel.
Jacob does a 4th wall break there. Yeah. Right. So he's dying. He's 147 now. And this whole thing is about this chapter. Really, the emphasis is on Manasseh and Ephraim, right? God Almighty appeared to me at Luz. Luz is Bethel, right? So like Jacob, so it's that same thing. Whenever he appeared to him at Bethel, and remember he appeared to him at Bethel as he was leaving, and actually as he came back in, right? So that same God, that's the God that he's talking about that appeared to him there, and he's imparting, and so this specific scene, just Joseph is there, right? Like Manasseh and Ephraim are like they're in the scene, but like that's not like who he's talking to. Like he's talking to Joseph, right? And you have this line where he again, like I said, he's imparting the covenant promises onto them, but he's going through this kind of adoption process, right? We have like a grandfather adopting his grandsons, right? And the reason why you would do this is for the purposes of inheritance, right? It's a way of giving. It's actually a way of giving Joseph an additional inheritance, rather than giving Joseph the same amount of an allotment as all of his other sons. By doing this, he's essentially giving him 2 allotments. Okay, like that's what he's doing. So it's
I thought he was just dividing the allotment for Joseph.
no, it's a way of giving 2, and it's also an explanation because there's a lot of it's a way of it's a way of giving 2, and it's a way of maintaining kind of this idea of the 12. Even in so it gets like complicated, and you because the Levites are not going to get an allotment of land, right? The Levites instead will get like sanctuary cities, right? And kind of like tasks, but the Levites don't get an allotment of land. And also, very importantly, as they're going through the Exodus, there's a whole big long description about like how the camps are oriented around the tabernacle, and it's like 3, 3, 3, and 3, but the Levites are in the center around the tabernacle, kind of protecting the tabernacle, and then you have 3, 3, 3, 3, and the only reason why you're able to do that is because you've split one of the tribes and they're half tribes. Okay.
But of course, these, I would be surprised if you got more, but like these points and like the point of like, oh, what keeps the 12? Is that something that's going through Jacob's mind, or is that something that God's ordaining through Jacob? Just like, hey, God's like, you're going to want to do this because one of your sons, you're not going to give him land.
So again, like, probably not, right? That's probably not going through Jacob's head. But and again, this depends on like how, like what view you want to have. Like, is this like, if you're gonna have your more liberal view and they're all like, oh, they're making up etymology in the past for explaining why things currently are this way or such a thing. But then, and like, again, when we've talked about this before, there's tons of problems with that. But then, like, from my view of how I think it's handling it, I don't think that like Jacob like knows exactly how all of the like tabernacle stuff is going to work out. Because obviously, if he did, you then have the problem of like, well, why didn't he write it all down? Why did Moses have to have this big Sinai encounter where he comes up with all this stuff and he writes this big long end portion of like Leviticus and Numbers? It's all about like how the tabernacle is set up. Like, no, it's probably that he feels that he should be doing this for, and we're actually going to get into that. It is kind of for strange, mysterious, supernatural inspiration kind of a thing. That's definitely in view here, I think. Especially if we kind of like look at the symbolic elements of what's going on, which we will in a bit. But yeah, I think it's just a kind of a God ordained thing of like, Jacob, you need to bless these kids in such a way, but not necessarily telling him how that's going to play out in the future.
Is this something that we ever see happen to the Hebrews, like after this, or in anyone in the time at this, like blessing your sons?
Like the adoption of a grandson?
Yeah.
I don't know about necessarily the adoption, specifically an adoption of the grandson. I know from like the commentaries that I've read that there are references to that happening in other like surrounding cultures of people doing the adoption of the grandson thing. Even like whenever we were reading the stuff about like Romans and like the Roman succession of emperors, that all happened through like adoption of like different people. In fact, all of like the Roman Empire, like the first 5 Roman emperors, it's a direct line but it's a direct line through adoption, and in
Right.
fact, actually, none of the people are like related to each other, like directly from like successor
They're
to
all bad
successor.
dads. They didn't want their
Y-
kids.
They kind of are all bad dads. So it's really it's like that aspect of adoption is like kind of typical. But usually it's just like kind of a generic blessing.
Because it just
It's
kind of made me think of how God used how hadn't heard this before in the class, that circumcision wasn't just like something that God was like, hey, this is a new thing, you're doing this.
yeah,
How
right.
that was like a thing at the time, and that was incorporated in that part of the
Exactly. Yeah.
story. So that's kind of like this in a sense, but
Exactly. I would think that this adoption process, and specifically it's probably a thing that's like adopted at the time, and also generic blessings of the kids are probably adopted, or probably a common thing at the time, especially considering, as we're going to get to it, as the process happens, it's very clear that Joseph has an expectation of what's about to happen. And so because of that, Joseph
He
makes
did have the dream.
but Joseph makes certain predictions about like we'll get into that when we get into it, because it's later in the chapter. So I want to keep going for some verses. Okay, so there's this line about Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are, and so there's a lot of like discussion about that, because that's kind of a thrown in like little phrase, and nobody really knows like why are Reuben and Simeon mentioned there. Are like these two supposed to replace them, because like there's also like this trouble with Reuben and Simeon, but they don't replace them. Reuben and Simeon get allotments.
They're the first two kids, so wouldn't it just be there as much as my kids as my first two kids are?
And it could be something like that. It probably is something like that. Then there's also kind of an idea of like so there's actually an idea of am I supposed to talk about this part or later? No, screw it. It doesn't matter. Can someone go to Jeremiah 31:9? So the other idea is that they're not replacing them, as in like Reuben and Simeon are not getting an allotment, but maybe they're replacing them in preeminence, as in like he's going to make them the first and second born in like the order. And actually there's some credence to this, because if you actually look at like a map of like the allotments of the 12 tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim are like huge. They get really, really big territories of land. And actually so much so that
are they the furthest north? No.
no, they're not the furthest north. So they're kind of in like the middle. But and actually later on, like there are going to be times whenever like the entire northern tribe is actually referred to as just Ephraim. And did you get that verse?
Mhm.
Can you read it?
Tears of joy will stream down their faces, and I will lead them home with great care. They will walk beside quiet streams and on smooth paths where they will not stumble. For I am Israel's father, and Ephraim is my oldest child.
Right. So you have this line where, for I am the father to Israel, and Ephraim is my firstborn. And so you have this very weird thing where suddenly Ephraim is the firstborn in the order of like the tribes.
Well, because had he done this blessing to any of the other sons yet?
No, not really. He's going to end up, the kind of generic blessings of all the sons is actually going to happen in the next chapter. So yes, he is
Surely if
kind
you
of
bless them, they probably would have put that in here. I think we can just by now, it's not like
right.
I think it'd be dumb to assume, oh well, maybe he had something that they didn't put in the text.
And so there's that. Was there another thing? Well, I've kind of already mentioned it, but the allotment, they're going to be separated out by their inheritance. Yeah, so we'll keep going from there.
When Israel saw Joseph's sons, he said, "Who are these?" Joseph said to his father, "They are my sons, whom God has given me here." And he said-
been there for 17 years though.
Right. Okay. So
Let's not move on.
so we're gonna talk about this. So this is a very clear indication of like,
Him being seen.
well, but this is what like your JEDP documentary hypothesis people are gonna be like. Look, they're two different stories, right? But like part of like the point and tone of this chapter is that, from my perspective, and so like you could just take the route of being like, oh, they're two different stories. That's why he suddenly like, oh, this verse, which a lot of the commentaries, like the documentary ones, like assume they're like, oh, he's never seen them, which also seems weird because right, he's been living there for 17 years. He never once saw his grandkids like that he knew existed for 17 years. To me, it makes much more sense that it's just an indicator of, it's like a reference to his eyes going, like he has bad vision.
Right.
And-
Well, because in two verses later, so and this is the funnier thing, because at 8 he says, when Israel saw them, but then at 10 he says, now the eyes of Israel will dim with age, so that he could not see. So
Because he's just generic people.
yeah, I think that's what
Yeah,
it is. It's
like,
seeing like blobs.
He can see like blobs, right? But he can't see them. And also, I didn't even think about this, but that's actually probably a good point, Diego, that this actually does have a lot of play with what happened with Jacob's dad and the whole scenario
Oh,
of
yeah.
of Jacob not being able to see. But in that instance, Jacob,
"Oh, I would have was the wrong one."
and well, but in that instance, it's Jacob tricking his father, right? And so you have kind of the blind father being tricked. But here, it's actually the blind father that's going to pull off the trick.
He's got one last laugh.
Yeah.
Before he hits the grave.
Which is his whole deal, right? So let's keep going.
"Bring them to me, please, that I may bless them." Now the eyes of Israel were dim with age, so they could not see. So Joseph brought them near him, and he kissed them and embraced them. And Israel said to Joseph, "I never expected to see your face, and behold, God has let me see your offspring also." Then Joseph removed them from his knees, and he bowed himself with his face to the earth.
So that like that Joseph removed them from his knees, like there's some thought that that might be because like we've talked a lot about like the whenever someone swears an oath, they like put your hand under like your thigh and like all this stuff, and there's all of this stuff about like being on the knees or like touching the thighs or whatever, and that being like the way that you're like imparting like your kind of identity and your like making them like a part of your family, or like you're swearing them, right, and all that stuff. And by them getting off of his knees is like kind of the idea is that that might have something to do with the adoption ritual itself, right? That like by them exiting and then going under to like be bowing under what Jacob's about to do, that's a part of like the whole like adoption thing. Like he's no longer like the direct father of Joseph, he's like a direct line of Jacob. Okay.
And Joseph took them both, Ephraim in his right hand toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh in his left hand toward Israel's right hand, and brought them near him. And Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and his left hand on the head of Manasseh, crossing his hands, for Manasseh was the firstborn. And he blessed Joseph and said,
Okay. So it takes a lot of time to explain that process, right? So the process is probably like important and signifying something, right? Because if the point of this whole thing is to just say, oh, he blessed the younger son versus the older son, why go through the rigmarole of explaining all the hand stuff, right? And so we're going to talk about that. So like, there's a nice picture here for it. And I like this because a lot of the pictures, if you look up the pictures of like this scene, it'll show you just Jacob and the crossing of the hands. But in my opinion, it's just as important that Jacob's hands are crossed, that Joseph's hands are not crossed, right? Because the verse also talks about the placement of Joseph's hands, right? And so you can look up tons of stuff about like the symbolism of left and right hand, super important, but just generically know that the right hand is like the superior, like higher blessing, the left hand is the lower blessing, which is obvious. So what's happening in this scene? Okay. Joseph knows that they're about to get blessed. And so what he does is he is expecting his father to bless his sons by placing his right hand on the older and his left hand on the younger. So if we like rotate this around, right? Because this whole thing is about expectation and perspective, right? Joseph is trying to accommodate for his father's weakness. His father can't see. His father's eyes are dim. He doesn't want his father to mess up. And so what he's doing is he has an expectation of what his father wants and what his father is going to do. So Joseph leads the boys in an awkward manner from his own perspective, right? In his own perspective, he should have the oldest here and the youngest here. But because he's trying to accommodate his father who has a different perspective, he switches the boys, the youngest on his right hand, and he has his oldest on his left hand. And that is the way that he approaches his father, right? He approaches his father with a certain level of expectation and attempting to accommodate his perspective. And what happens is his father, who is supposed to be blind from Joseph's perspective, who is supposed to not really be knowing what's going on, instead knows what's going on, and he crosses, right? And so obviously, like, from an English standpoint and all this stuff, it's like, ooh, cross, like, it's going to be related to the cross. Okay, on one hand, no, because it's just etymology, but on another hand, yes, like entirely. And that's what I'm trying to get you guys to see. And what I want to talk about is, okay, what happens? So what the father does when he crosses his hands, with that act of crossing his hands, he's doing two things simultaneously. He's subverting the son's expectations, right? Because, right, the son approaches him with a certain kind of expectation of what he's going to do. By crossing his hands, he's subverting his expectation. But the other thing that he does, right? Because if you imagine, right, I'm Jacob now, okay? I'm standing here, I've got the boy's hands. If I were to be rotated around, my hands are now the same as what Joseph's are, right? And so because of that, the act of crossing his hands both subverts his expectations and adopts the son's perspective, okay? And now if we think broadly about what the incarnation does, what it does is it both subverts our expectations of what we think God is going to do, and at the same time, with the exact same act, he is adopting our perspective. He's doing both of those things. Okay. So broadly speaking, there is kind of a connection to the incarnation here with this act and with this scene that's going on. And I think there will be a little bit more as we get to some of the later verses about what Joseph's response to Jacob doing this is. But we're going to put that on pause to talk about the blessing itself. Okay.
The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life long to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the boys, and in them let my name be carried on in the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth.
Okay. So if you guys remember, we've actually talked about this blessing before. Every single time that like the instance of the angel of the Lord has come up. And the reason why is because this is one of the best kind of like proof texts for from Jacob's perspective, right? Because Jacob is the one that's saying this. And if you don't believe that Jacob said it, okay, screw it. The person that wrote this perspective and how they think about Jacob, right? So it doesn't really matter which one of those you pick because they're both pretty significant. From the author's perspective and from Jacob's perspective, the God who was with Abraham and Isaac and who took care of Jacob, that's what shepherding all my life means, right? Who fed me, that the word there in Hebrew is fed, same thing as shepherd. That is the same being as the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, right? And if you remember we talked about last week, that's his whole life because he described his life as being few of years and full of evil, right? So those three things are all supposed to be the same being, and let that being bless the boys. So, like, it should be very clear that they're all thinking of this angel of the Lord character, and especially if you go back to those instances of, right, like at Luz and all this stuff, and the different parts of Jacob's life where God has redeemed something, right? And if you think of one instance where God most redeemed evil in his life, it should probably be when he's wrestling with him, right? That's the single greatest instance in his life where God redeemed something. That was an angel, and it's identifying it with that God. So any questions there? I mean, that should be, I already hammered that home in like past chapters. So
it also, this isn't, this is a more broad, there's a more broad point on this to say that this just kind of so happens to, it doesn't exactly map onto a Trinitary like depiction of God, but in the way it refers to God in three ways.
sure.
With one of them being, as we talked about, being more like a Christology
Sure.
depiction. In a sense, maps onto that. Though obviously, like you're not making like clear distinctions here.
You're not.
It's more about the three than it is about the aspects.
Yeah. And also, by the way, this in reference to like stuff happening that's similar to stuff that's going on in other cultures, kind of a thing. This like formula for a prayer or for a blessing, that is kind of very common in like surrounding Near Eastern cultures, where if you had a multitude of gods, they would list like a multitude of gods and have them bless in like different ways. But then if it was like a monotheistic thing, they would do aspects of like the god and then say that singular God bless. And so that's part of the other thing too, is that because we know that they're like monotheistic-ish in their like proclivities, that's what's going on here, and that they're not separate entities. All right, let's keep going.
When Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him, and he took his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said to his father, "Not this way, my father, since this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head." But his father refused and said, "I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his offspring shall become a multitude of nations."
Okay, we're gonna pause right there. So Joseph, just talked about the subversion stuff and everything. And what's Joseph's response to that? Joseph's response is to presume that his father did something wrong, right? And then he starts to act to switch, to change up what his father did, right? And so to go back to like incarnation stuff, the people that were expecting the people that were expecting God to move in a messianic way and to make all of these things, they had a certain expectation of what would happen. And then once he did it, they went, "Oh, no, you messed up. You did something wrong. Here, let me fix it and explain to you what you did wrong." And God's response, or the father's response, is, "No, I didn't mess up. I knew what I was doing." Right. And so, yes, it's a very rough mapping, but you kind of have that same idea of expectation and all that being played out in a larger scenario.
Well, it also just seems so ironic that, like, okay, the figure that is represented as being having an expectation of, like, oh, the oldest should be getting, the firstborn should be getting the full blessing, is Joseph,
Who's
of
not
all
even
people,
close, right?
who is not even close to being firstborn, didn't seem to have a problem with openly admitting that in his dreams before that he was actually going to be the one receiving the most authority out of his sons, who is also the son of Jacob, who also was fairly irreverent to the idea of needing to literally be firstborn.
Right.
So it's like, where did he even get this expectation from?
And again, and also, like, from a tonal thing, Joseph is the good son, right? Joseph is like the good son, like, in everything. And if you're following this analogy of like how it, to kind of move it up into the incarnation, in my like kind of thinking of how this maps on, Joseph is kind of like the Pharisees and the religious body that are like a part of like in that kind of story, and they have this certain expectation of that God's going to be bringing this political leader along. And just like you were saying, why would they like have expected that? Because like every single time that God made like a big move in the past, like he really didn't always have like I mean there like he didn't really bring about like a political solution. Like he like political, like you could say that it sort of happened with like David and stuff like here and there, but like he really didn't do that. And like a lot of times is advising them like, no, like that's not what I'm going to do. And like I'm not going to like they should know that their God is not a God that just plays into the hands of the world and tradition and what they all expect. And yet, what do they expect? They expect someone to come along that's going to beat up Caesar in the same way that Caesar's been going around beating around everybody else. They want their God to kind of act in the same way as all of the gods of the other nations, right? And
Right.
and it's not like they're, and this is one of the other things too, is that like the Pharisees kind of get crapped on a lot, but I don't know, I don't think we've talked about it in this class, but I've been trying to talk about more recently is like although Jesus says some harsh words about the Pharisees, he actually says some also very good things about the Pharisees. Like he says like follow what the Pharisees are doing, like do like what they say. What he says is he says do what they say, don't do what they do though, because then what they do is like their actual actions are hypocritical, but what they're saying and what they believe basically is correct, but how they're doing things is wrong. And so there's some interesting mapping onto there in this scene for that. I also want to talk a little bit about this idea of nevertheless, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his offspring shall become a multitude of nations. Like if you click on that, at least in mine, it's also sometimes translated as fullness. And I don't really have anything here other than to mention that there's a lot of discussion when you get into like end times prophecy stuff about the fullness of nations or the fullness of the Gentiles. Specifically, it's supposed to be that like the second coming will happen once the fullness of the Gentiles is complete, right? This is part of the reason why that like certain like denominations like AG and all this stuff are like, we need to go reach all of these lost people groups, right? And all this stuff, because once we reach every single people group, then Jesus will come back, because that's what we are expecting and
It sounds like a
interpreting.
video game.
Right. It's like, well, because it's
Achievement hunting.
that's what we are expecting is the fullness of the Gentiles, right? And I think it's interesting that you also that you have this kind of phrase here in the blessing of Ephraim with the fullness of the nations, because there's this idea. It comes out later, but the reunite. It's like it's the reuniting of the tribes of Israel and the finding of the lost tribe and the finding of the lost 10 tribes. And this is where do you guys know what like the Hebrew Israelites and stuff are? So the Black Hebrew Israelites are particularly a group of they're really radical, but they have this idea that like all of these different minority groups are secretly like one of the lost tribes of Israel, and like once they all come into like consciousness about that, they'll be able to like rejoin and kind of like take over, I guess. While that is wrong, there's an element to it that actually is kind of right. And the element to it that is kind of right is that the northern tribe, which we already talked about, is kind of Ephraim, like kind of Ephraim is kind of identified with the whole northern tribe, but the northern kingdom is also identified with the 10 tribes of Israel, right? The 10 tribes, not including Judah and Benjamin, who are the southern tribes. They are talked about in scripture in numerous places as mixing in with kind of the rest of the Gentiles. So kind of like hidden within the Gentiles, and it's all Gentile groups, is kind of like the blood of these 10 tribes. And so the way that the 10 tribes are going to be brought back is by bringing in all of the Gentiles. By bringing in all of the Gentiles, it's going to bring back all of those 10 tribes. If I had done better prep work, I would have. Heiser has a big, like, a couple of podcasts like on this where he talks about this, and I would have reviewed those, and I didn't. So if you want to, you can go find those where he talks about those.
But just to be clear, you just mean Christ dying brings in the Gentiles. And so
Yes.
clearly Christ's death unites the lost tribes.
Correct. Christ's death is doing exactly that. And so that's a way in which you can, when you're reading all these aspects in the Old Testament, they're again signs and shadows of what Christ is going to do. And
So people, if they're talking about a tribe in this day still being lost or whatever is going to be reincorporated. That should be taken as like, no, that's done years ago.
Well, like the process of it happening, I would say the process of that happening began with Christ,
Okay.
and that it is an ongoing process. But what it looks like is not the way that like Black Hebrew Israelites think it is, which is like, oh, we all just come to this understanding, we all group up and we take over the world. No, the way that this process happens is people come to Christ and are unified as one body. Like, that's what I'm trying to argue for. It's just I'm trying to say that it's just that line of thinking is just kind of an Old Testament way of what it goes back to of saying the same thing that Christians say whenever they're like, oh, we need to go in the whole world and create disciples and everything.
Yeah.
That's the way that we're gonna like bring this all to come about.
Not to take away from that whole point, when you said that yours translates multitude as being full, mine also says that instead of saying grow into multitude, it says, well, let them be like fish for multitude.
Oh,
Which I don't see how you could possibly interpret that pre Jesus feeding the 5,000, because that seems to be the only
well, and the whole
relative-
idea of being fishers of men and everything.
yeah, that seems to be the only way that could be like have any sort of like relative meaning, other than if it's some like really old idiom. But it would be beyond me what that would mean. That wouldn't work better than if it was referencing that. So it's weird that that can be translated that way.
Mhm. All right, let's finish it up.
So he blessed them that day, saying, by you Israel will pronounce blessing, saying, God make you as Ephraim and as Manasseh. Thus he put Ephraim before Manasseh.
So part of that, by you Israel will pronounce blessing, saying, a couple of different commentaries were all saying that like that might be a reference to like other places in the Bible and stuff where people say like it is said unto this day or whatever, like that phrase of God make you as Ephraim and Manasseh probably at the time of the writing was a phrase that was like going around. And so again, from the standpoint of it, if you're from the standpoint of this whole story is trying to be used to explain conditions that are happening today, they would say, oh, well, this is a phrase that's going around. God make you as Ephraim and Manasseh. Ephraim and Manasseh were probably really big tribes, but they had like this connection or whatever. And so this whole story was like made up to explain like why A, they're so big, and why B, like this phrase is like going around, which seems kind of circular, because if this story is being made up to explain why the phrase was around, that just explains the writing of this down. That doesn't actually explain why that phrase became a phrase in the first place, right? Like if you're saying, oh, this was a phrase that was around, and then you wrote this story here in the timeline to explain why it was a phrase, well, it was still a phrase. And so you don't have an actual explanation for what the origin of the phrase is, that's what you're believing, right? Does that make sense? What I'm trying to say there? So again, just trying to go against that, and we'll finish it up.
Then Israel said to Joseph, behold, I am about to die, but God will be with you and will bring you again to the land of your fathers. Moreover, I have given to you, rather than to your brothers, one mountain slope that I took from the hand of the Amorites with my sword and with my bow.
Okay. So one, we have a little bit of a prediction. God will be with you and will bring you again to the land of your fathers, right? This little like prophecy of the Exodus, which is about to happen in this story. But then you also have this line about one mountain slope. I would be curious as to what your guys' versions say there for the
Mine
one
says ridge of land.
ridge of land.
Mine is interesting. So it does say one mountain slope, but it then says it can be read as one portion of land. Hebrew Shechem, which
Right.
sounds like a town and district called Shechem. So
Right.
it sounds like in this, like a way you could read it is, moreover, I gave you I gave you rather than your brothers Shechem.
Yes. And so that's so on the face of it, basically nobody knows what this line is talking about. Because the instance of him that I took from the hand of the Amorites with my sword and my bow, that's not really talked about. Like, people are just like, what? Like, when did that happen? You don't really know. So your options are for how you want to interpret this is, one, there's a random mountain slope somewhere that he took from the Amorites in a fight that wasn't recorded anywhere else in scripture. That's one option. Okay, maybe that's what it is. The other option is the Shechem option, which that it's a reference to Shechem. Now, Jacob purchased some land in Shechem, which is recorded earlier. And it is by I believe it's Mount Gerizim. It's by Mount Gerizim, which is by Shechem. And so people are like, oh, maybe it's a reference to whenever he bought that. But why is he saying that he got it from a fight? Because he bought that. Well, if you remember, well, more specifically, Shechem is whenever that whole story about Dinah being raped by Shechem, and his sons went over there and killed them all after being circumcised. But it's not clear that the tribe of Shechem that was there, that they were Amorites. Well, apparently there's some evidence to suggest that the term Amorites could just be a generic term for people that kind of lived in the land of Canaan at the time. This gets used for actually a lot of different terms. There are a couple of different terms that kind of get thrown around at different periods that scholars believe this may just be being used as a generic term to refer to just anyone in the region. And there might also be some like time delay thing that's going on here where at one point in time, the Amorites are largely in charge. So everybody in the area gets referred to as Amorites. And then at another point in time, everybody in the area is largely like Canaanite or something else. And so everybody in the area gets referred to as just Canaanites. Because there's actually a big debate as to whether or not Canaanite is a specific term for people or a generic term for anybody in the whole thing. And there's, like I said, there's a couple of different terms that people have this debate about. So it could be referencing that. People are not really sure as to what specifically.
Wouldn't it be weird for him to
referencing that.
claim that as him, like that instance is him taking that land over?
It
with
would
his-
be.
Because didn't he then like scold the brothers for doing that?
He did. And so it's weird if that's what it is.
Because then it'd be like the way it comes off in the first story is like, you shouldn't have done that. That wasn't like the correct thing to do.
Right.
But then in this story, it's like, no, that was kind of all political ploy so that I could end up with this.
Take it
this
over
area.
and then give it down as inheritance. Like, it's confusing. Like, I have not been able to get a clear answer as to what that verse is like supposed to be about. I kind of can't make heads or tails of it. So that's why I was just like, these are the options that different people talked about. So yeah, not really sure. But I think that's basically it.
The only other thing I noticed was that, as far as I can tell with the blessing, like Jacob doesn't actually distinctly state a difference in the blessing until Joseph's like, "Hey, don't do that with your hands."
Yeah,
Because, like, up until that point, he says the exact same blessing for both.
yeah.
And then once-
it's just the hands that are different.
Yeah, and then once Joseph calls attention to it, then he's like, "Oh yeah, this is just the way it's gonna work. He's gonna have more." So it's like, how much of that is really, that they were going to be blessed disproportionately versus like before the attention was called to it versus like after. He's like, okay, yeah, now that you've addressed it, this is the way it's gonna be.
It's
Kind of
hard
like
to
a
say.
paradox if you really think about it in one way, because it's like, oh well, this had to be revealed, but it was only revealed because he did this weird. But he did this weird because he wanted it to be revealed. So that it's like, was it like that?
Well, actually, that was another point was that should this be happening at all? Because like it kind of brings up to the point like, okay, since we're doing it, the blessing was actually essentially passed down from Joseph's perspective, or it came out the way his hands were initially was the way the blessing was done. Should Joseph have just been the one doing the blessing in the first place?
Well, right. You have that issue of that, like Jacob is supposed to be like giving, like Jacob is supposed to be giving blessings to his sons, but because Jacob's supposed to be giving blessings to his sons. So right, like should Joseph have just been like, oh, I'm just gonna go up there?
Well, not even that. Maybe Joseph gets a blessing, but that this whole blessing, like the blessing that his son should have received, should have just come from Joseph and not come from Jacob. Because, well, essentially, it did come from Joseph because his initial orientation was the way the blessing came down.
Yeah, yes, exactly. It's the way that and it kind of gets back to actually even a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about, right? Within the entirety of the Joseph story, right? What people do mistakenly ends up being the thing that God uses, right? Like that's the whole theme of the Joseph story, right? The brothers put Joseph in there. That ends up being the thing that saves them, right? That ends up being like the fact that they put Joseph in there ends up being the thing that like is the thing that God uses. He constantly throughout the story is using the ways that people are messing up. That's actually the way that God ends up blessing them. And actually exactly right here, because of Joseph's expectations of how he comes up, how he messes up, that ends up being the exact way that they get blessed.
So the other thing is that like none of the other sons of Jacob bring their sons up for this thing either.
No.
So it's like what are you doing here, Joseph? Like honestly.
But it's not, to be fair. I mean, I just glossed back over the first like 10 verses. There's nothing about a blessing. It's not like Joseph's told, "Behold, your father is ill. He wants to bless your children." Or "Behold, your father's ill. Bring your children so he may bless them."
Yeah.
He's just bringing his kids. He's like, "Hey, my dad's dying. Let's go see him." And so then he gets there, and what is that verse? Even by the time he says, "No, his eyes were dim," even by that point, a blessing still hasn't been mentioned. It's not until 11,
right? And then
whatever, maybe it's one behind that. But it comes up later than the start, saying, "Oh, bring them forth so I may bless them."
Right.
It doesn't seem like Joseph's expecting anything special. He's just like, "We're just gonna."
Well, and that's where I would disagree. That I think that Joseph is expecting a blessing, and that's why
On his children.
on his children, and that's why he has them oriented the way he does. Right?
Well, he has them oriented the way he does after he hears that they're going to get blessed, though.
Sure. Well, I guess
Your argument for him thinking they're going to be blessed could be him bringing them in the first place.
yeah, and I guess
But
we don't fully know that.
We don't know if it's like, oh, Dad, do you want us to come with you, or
Just
oh,
to
Dad,
see
I
you,
want to be
or
grandpa."
yeah, exactly.
You know, it's like something we can't really reflect our morals on.
And that's where we're probably not in a good. We're
Yeah.
probably not in a close enough
Right.
like time frame to know the cultural context of like, hey, is this something that just kind of happens like all the time? Would people have like when going to see like their dying relatives, would they have expected that the blessing was going to be happening around that time? I mean, I guess if you can think about it to like the other times, like they probably were expecting some type of a blessing, whether it was should Joseph had been expecting blessings for his kids, maybe not, because if you think other instances that we know of, right? So whenever Isaac is blessing his kids, at that time, presumably Esau has kids whenever Isaac does. We don't really know. It's not clear. We don't have any indication of Esau taking his. We know that Esau's married at that point because they're mad about it. So like maybe Esau brought his kids to Isaac to get blessed. We don't have that recorded. We don't know. So yeah, we're just kind of in a big I don't know space for a lot of that.
Yeah. The other thing that jumped out at me was that the displeasure, because of the like kind of adoption that happens here, the displeasure that Joseph sees at Ephraim getting made first is essentially this, like he is now in the same position as all of his other brothers were when Joseph told them, I'm going to be above you, because now his sons have now been elevated to the same status as brother, and then he doesn't have any control now over, actually that one is even above you, and referenced way later as the firstborn.
Yeah.
It makes sense that there'd be a lot of displeasure there, but also how that whole concept comes back to the idea of he was last will be first. Like to the extreme,
and to the extreme, because he's not even in the original things, and then of that one, he's the last,
he
and he ends up becoming the first
of the whole group. Out of all of those set of men, he is literally the last born.
And actually,
by necessity.
arguably, because they're supposed to be like, I believe, maybe I'd have to go back and check this, but I believe they're supposed to be like included in like the number of like the 70, right? That like go there. So of the number of the 70,
they were the last
there,
4 included, because it was Joseph, his wife, and the 2 kids.
The 2 kids.
So they're technically, he's the youngest of the 2 kids. He's the very last.
Of those 70, he is probably the last of those 70, and arguably
was just now made first.
It was just now made. Later on through events is made first over everybody. So yeah, so that is like a thing.
I had thought with verse 20, the blessing, he says, by you Israel will pronounce blessing, saying, God make you as Ephraim and as Manasseh. I understand that the verse just before that is talking about how Ephraim will be greater in multitude. However, it doesn't explicitly say God make you as Ephraim and Manasseh because they were good in number, but it doesn't say that. So my first thought when we went through this was, oh, well, make them as like adopted, like, oh, God make you as Manasseh and Ephraim because you are not of the line of the family of God's chosen people, but God make you of the line just as Manasseh and
yeah, that's true. I guess we don't know.
To me, that's even a better thing to receive that blessing.
Exactly, and also we don't, like I said, we don't necessarily. I mean, it's clear that it is an idiom, but we don't necessarily know how that idiom was used in the context of the culture.
As far as you know, did you find that anywhere else?
I did not find that anywhere.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know how that was used. So it arguably could have been used either way. It could have been used as right because there's some kind of assumption that's being made there in the idiom, right? That's how all idioms work. So there's some kind of assumption like underlining it. And the assumption is probably either I'm saying this because I want you to just have a lot of kids and be great and successful, or I'm saying this because I want you to be adopted and brought into preeminence. Like it could be either of those things. So I'm gonna stop the recording there.